The hallways of Westfield Conservatory always felt different at night. During the day, they buzzed with the sounds of 100 instruments playing at once. Pianos, violins, cellos, and flutes creating a beautiful chaos that echoed off the walls. But at night, when Rosa Morales pushed her cleaning cart through those same hallways, the building held its breath as if waiting for something. Rosa had been the night janitor at the prestigious music school for almost 7 years now. She knew every corner of the building, which practice room doors squeaked, which drinking fountains leaked, and which windows let in drafts during winter storms. The teachers and students rarely noticed her during the day, and she preferred it that way. Less notice meant less trouble, and Rosa had worked too hard for too long to risk any problems. Tonight was Thursday, which meant Rosa would clean the East Wing practice rooms. This was secretly her favorite night of the week because of Practice Room C, home to the school's finest grand piano. The magnificent instrument sat in the center of the room like a sleeping giant, its polished black surface reflecting the dim safety lights that remained on after hours. Rosa finished mopping the hallway floors and checked her watch. 11:30 p.m. Perfect timing. The security guard, Mr. Paulson, would be taking his coffee break in the staff lounge on the other side of the building. For the next 20 minutes, Rosa could indulge in her secret passion without worry. She slipped into Practice Room C and closed the door quietly behind her. From the pocket of her uniform, she pulled out several folded sheets of paper, creased and worn from frequent handling. Rosa smoothed them out carefully on the piano's music stand. The pages were filled with handwritten musical notes, some crossed out, others circled, with scribbled comments in the margins. Rosa sat on the bench and ran her fingertips lightly over the keys without pressing them. Then she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody that filled the room wasn't one that any student at Westfield would recognize from their classical training. It moved between joyful and melancholy, drawing from the folk songs Rosa's father had taught her on their old upright piano in their tiny apartment back home. He had never learned to read music properly, and neither had she, but he could play anything after hearing it once, a gift he'd passed on to his daughter. Rosa had developed her own system of notation, imperfect but meaningful to her. She'd been working on this particular piece for months, tweaking it here and there, trying to capture the feeling of her childhood neighborhood at sunset, when everyone would bring their chairs outside to escape the heat of their homes. She became so lost in her playing that she didn't hear the door open slightly, didn't notice the figure pausing in the hallway listening. The next morning, Professor Harold Thompson arrived at the conservatory earlier than usual. At 57, he was the school's most celebrated piano instructor, with former students now performing in concert halls around the world. His recordings of Chopin's complete works had earned him international recognition, and his opinion on all matters musical was treated as gospel within Westfield's walls. Professor Thompson prided himself on recognizing and cultivating proper talent. He believed musical ability was like fine wine. It required the right origins, careful cultivation, and proper aging under expert guidance. Self-taught musicians were, in his view, like homemade moonshine, crude, unrefined, and ultimately disappointing. As he unlocked Practice Room C for his morning preparation, he noticed several sheets of paper left on the piano. Picking them up with a furrowed brow, he examined the strange markings that barely resembled proper musical notation. Some notes were drawn larger than others, with arrows and circles and words like "softer here" or "like rainfall" written above certain measures. Professor Thompson was still studying the pages when 3 of his graduate students, Liam, Priya, and Chen, arrived for their morning workshop. "Professor, is everything all right?" Priya asked, noticing his sour expression. The professor held up the pages with 2 fingers as if they might contaminate him. "This," he announced with theatrical disdain, "is precisely what happens when someone without proper musical education attempts composition." The students gathered around, peering at Rosa's handwritten music. "Look at these amateur time signatures," Professor Thompson continued, pointing at the page. "The clumsy key changes, the childish annotations." He shook his head dramatically. "This is why formal training matters. You can't simply feel your way through music. It's a discipline, a science as much as an art." Liam, always eager to impress, laughed a bit too loudly. "It looks like something a kindergartner would draw," he said. Chen and Priya exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. I wonder who left this here, Professor Thompson mused. Flipping the pages over to look for a name, finding none, he walked to the bulletin board in the hallway outside the practice rooms. With deliberate movements, he pinned Rosa's composition to the cork surface, uncapping a red marker to write above it, "Examples of common compositional mistakes." "Let this be a learning opportunity," he told his students with a smug smile. "Sometimes the best lessons come from seeing what not to do." The three students nodded, though only Liam seemed truly amused. The professor turned back into practice room C, already talking about the day's lesson on advanced arpeggios, unaware that just around the corner Rosa stood frozen, a mop clutched in her hands. She had returned to the practice room that morning when she realized with a jolt of panic that she'd left her music behind. She'd hoped to slip in and retrieve it before anyone noticed, but she was too late. Every word of the professor's mockery had reached her ears, each one stinging like a physical blow. Rosa watched from her hiding spot as the professor and his students disappeared into the practice room. Then she approached the bulletin board with heavy steps. There was her music, her personal creation, displayed like a joke for all to see. She reached up to take it down but stopped when she heard voices approaching from the main hallway. A group of first-year students was heading toward the practice rooms, chatting excitedly about their upcoming recitals. Swallowing hard, Rosa turned away from the bulletin board and pushed her cleaning cart quickly in the opposite direction. She couldn't risk being seen removing the music. It would only confirm that she was the person responsible for the mistakes the professor had mocked. The shame of it burned in her chest as she retreated to the janitor's closet and closed the door behind her. In the small, dimly lit space that smelled of cleaning products, Rosa leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Why had she been so careless? For years she had been careful, playing only when she was certain no one was around, always taking her music with her. One mistake, and now she was being ridiculed by the school's most important professor. As she sorted through her cleaning supplies to prepare for the rest of her shift, Rosa made a silent promise to herself. She would never play the practice room pianos again. Her music wasn't good enough for a place like Westfield. Professor Thompson had made that abundantly clear. For the rest of the day, Rosa kept her head down as she went about her duties. She avoided the East Wing entirely, asking another custodian to cover that area for her. She couldn't bear to see her music displayed like that. Couldn't stand the thought of students and teachers walking past it, perhaps adding their own laughter to the professor's criticism. What Rosa didn't see was Nico, a quiet first-year student with thick glasses, stopping at the bulletin board between classes. Nico, who struggled with traditional notation despite his perfect pitch, studied Rosa's unconventional system with growing interest rather than mockery. He didn't see mistakes. He saw someone trying to capture sounds in a way that made sense to them, just as he often did. Nor did Rosa see Chen return to the bulletin board later that afternoon, frowning at the professor's cruel display. Chen had grown up watching his grandmother play traditional Chinese instruments without ever reading Western notation. The music Rosa had written reminded him of his grandmother's hand-drawn notes, full of personal symbols that spoke to the heart, rather than to rigid academic rules. As the day came to an end and students began filtering out of the building, Rosa emerged from the shadows to continue her cleaning duties. Her movements were mechanical, her usual care replaced by a numb efficiency. The joy that had always made her work bearable, knowing that she might steal a few moments at the piano afterward, was gone. What Rosa couldn't know was that her music, even in its public humiliation, had already begun to speak to others. Those who understood that true music could grow from unlikely places, that passion didn't always follow the rules, and that sometimes the most beautiful melodies came from untrained hands guided only by the rhythm of the heart. But tonight, as she pushed her cart past practice room C without stopping, all Rosa felt was the heavy silence of a dream put away, of music unplayed, of a voice too afraid to sing. For the next few days, Rosa moved through the hallways of Westfield Conservatory like a ghost. She did her job well. The floors were spotless, the trash cans emptied, the windows gleaming, but the light had gone out of her eyes. Each time she passed practice room C, she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the magnificent piano inside. It was like walking past the home of an old far. Her music had disappeared from the bulletin board by the second day. Rosa didn't know who had taken it down, Perhaps a kind soul who recognized the cruelty of the display, or maybe just the janitor who cleaned that area. It didn't matter. The damage was done. On the fourth day after the incident, Rosa was polishing the brass handrails in the main stairwell when she heard someone approaching. She didn't look up, accustomed to being invisible to the students and teachers who passed by. "Excuse me," said a quiet voice. Rosa glanced up to see a young man with thick glasses standing on the step above her. She recognized him as one of the first-year students, though she couldn't recall his name. "Yes?" she asked, surprised to be addressed directly. She straightened up, cloth still in hand. The young man shifted nervously from foot to foot. "I'm Nico," he said. I was wondering if you knew who wrote the music that was on the bulletin board a few days ago." Rosa froze. Had he somehow figured out it was hers? Was he here to join in the mockery? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said stiffly, turning back to the handrail. "Oh." Nico sounded disappointed. "It's just that I thought it was really interesting. The notation system was different, but I could see what they were trying to do. It reminded me of how I used to write music before I came here." Rosa's hand stilled on the brass rail. Slowly, she turned back toward him. You liked it?" Nico's face brightened. "I did." Professor Thompson was completely wrong about it. Sure, it wasn't traditional notation, but music doesn't have to follow all the rules to be good. Some of the best pieces break the rules. For a moment, Rosa considered telling him the truth. The words were right there, ready to spill out. "It was mine. I wrote that music." But years of keeping to herself, of staying invisible, held her back. "I'll let the composer know if I see them," she said instead, offering a small smile. Nico nodded and continued up the stairs, but paused at the top. "The winter showcase is coming up in 2 weeks," he called down to her. "Anyone can sign up to perform, even staff members." Then he was gone, leaving Rosa standing on the stairs, the polishing cloth limp in her hand. The winter showcase. Rosa had cleaned up after it for the past 6 years. It was one of the conservatory's biggest events, with students performing for their families, teachers, and even some local music critics. The thought of playing her music in front of all those people, in front of Professor Thompson, made her stomach twist into knots. Yet as she finished her shift that night, the idea refused to leave her mind. What if she did sign up? What if she showed them all that her music, however unconventionally notated, had value? The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. When Rosa arrived for work the next evening, she found herself taking a detour to the bulletin board near the main office. A large sign-up sheet for the winter showcase was pinned there, already half filled with student names and their planned performances. At the bottom was a note: "Open to all Westfield community members, students, faculty, and staff." Rosa stared at the sheet for a long time. Then, before she could change her mind, she quickly scribbled, "Rosa Morales, original composition," in the second-to-last slot. Her heart pounded as if she'd just run a mile. What had she done? She was still standing there, slightly dazed, when a voice behind her made her jump. "You're signing up for the showcase? That's wonderful." Rosa turned to see Chen, one of Professor Thompson's graduate students who had been present during the humiliating critique. She immediately tensed, expecting ridicule, but Chen was smiling genuinely. "What will you be playing?" he asked. "Just something I wrote," Rosa said cautiously. "Nothing fancy. An original composition?" Chen looked impressed. "That takes courage. Most students just perform the classics." Rosa wasn't sure how to respond. Why was this student being so nice to her? Hadn't he laughed along with his professor at her music? As if reading her thoughts, Chen's expression grew serious. "I want to apologize for what happened the other day, with Professor Thompson and that music on the bulletin board. It wasn't right." "You don't need to apologize," Rosa said, though his words soothed a small part of the hurt she'd been carrying. "I do," Chen insisted. "I should have spoken up." He hesitated, then added, "The notation reminded me of my grandmother. She plays the guzheng. It's a Chinese string instrument, and she has her own way of writing music too. Not the standard Western style." Rosa felt a strange connection to this unknown woman on the other side of the world. "Does she perform?" "All the time," Chen said with a smile. "She says music isn't meant to sit quietly on paper. It needs to be set free." Those words stayed with Rosa as she went about her cleaning duties that night. Music isn't meant to sit quietly on paper. It needs to be set free. Perhaps her music, the melodies that had lived only in her head and heart for so long, deserved that freedom. For the next week and a half, Rosa found a new rhythm to her evenings. She would complete her cleaning tasks with remarkable efficiency, then slip into the auditorium during her break. The huge space was always empty at that hour, the stage lit only by a single safety light. There, on the concert grand piano, Rosa would practice her composition, making adjustments, building her confidence. She chose to play the piece she'd been working on for months, the one Professor Thompson had mocked. It was a musical journey through her life, beginning with the folk melodies of her childhood, moving through the challenges and sorrows of her adult years, and ending with a hopeful, resilient theme that represented her dreams for the future. What Rosa didn't know was that she wasn't always alone during these late-night rehearsals. Nico had told a few friends about the mysterious custodian who might be a secret musical genius. Occasionally, they would sneak into the darkened balcony to listen, enchanted by music unlike anything taught in their classes. Word spread quietly among a small group of students. They never disturbed her, never let their presence be known, but they were there, witnessing something rare and beautiful. 3 days before the showcase, Rosa was closing the piano after her practice when she heard a soft noise from the back of the auditorium. Startled, she peered into the darkness. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. A moment later, Priya, another of Professor Thompson's graduate students, emerged from the shadows. Rosa's body tensed. Had she come to tell her not to make a fool of herself at the showcase? "I'm sorry for spying," Priya said, walking down the center aisle toward the stage. I heard you playing and I couldn't walk away." Rosa stood frozen by the piano, unsure what to say. "Your music is beautiful," Priya continued, stopping at the edge of the stage and looking up at Rosa. "It's different from what we're taught here, but it's real. I can feel the story in it." "Thank you," Rosa managed, the words catching in her throat. "Professor Thompson is going to be at the showcase," Priya warned. "He's not kind to performances that don't meet his standards." "I know," Rosa said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "But I'm not playing for him." Priya smiled. "Good, play for yourself. Play for the music." She turned to leave, then paused. "Some of us will be there to support you, just so you know." As the day of the showcase drew nearer, Rosa's nerves grew increasingly frayed. During the day, doubts would creep in. Who was she to think she could perform alongside trained musicians? Wasn't she just setting herself up for public humiliation? But in the evenings, when her fingers touched the piano keys and her music filled the empty auditorium, those doubts faded away. The morning of the showcase, Rosa found a small package outside the janitor's closet with her name on it. Inside was a beautiful blue scarf with a note, "For good luck tonight. Music isn't meant to sit quietly on paper." "Friends?" Rosa recognized Chen's words and felt tears spring to her eyes. She had been so focused on proving Professor Thompson wrong that she hadn't noticed the small community forming around her, supporting her. That night, as she prepared to clean the building one last time before changing for her performance, Rosa realized something important. Whether her music impressed the professor or not no longer mattered. She had already accomplished something remarkable. She had found her courage, and in doing so, she had found her voice. With the blue scarf tucked safely in her pocket, Rosa began her final rounds, counting down the hours until she would step onto the stage and set her music free. The day of the winter showcase arrived with a flurry of activity at Westfield Conservatory. Students rushed through the hallways carrying instrument cases and formal attire. Teachers posted last-minute scheduled changes, and the auditorium buzzed with technicians checking microphones and adjusting lights. Through it all, Rosa continued her cleaning duties as if it were any ordinary day, though the blue scarf was tucked safely in her pocket, a constant reminder of what was to come. By mid-afternoon, Rosa had finished her shift. She slipped away to the small employee locker room to change into the outfit she had carefully selected for her performance. A simple black skirt, a crisp white blouse, and low heels she had polished until they shone. She wrapped the blue scarf around her neck, its soft fabric giving her a strange sense of courage. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself without the gray janitor's uniform she wore day after day. As she was pinning up her hair, The door opened and Ms. Beatrice, the head of cafeteria services, walked in. She stopped short when she saw Rosa. "My goodness, look at you," Ms. Beatrice exclaimed, breaking into a wide smile. "I heard the rumors that you were performing tonight, but I didn't quite believe them." Rosa blushed. "It's nothing fancy. Just a small piece I wrote." "Nothing fancy," she says. Ms. Beatrice laughed, shaking her head. "Do you know how many people work in this building for years without ever having the guts to show their talent?" She patted Rosa's shoulder. "I'll be in the audience cheering you on. Some of the other staff are coming too." The thought of her co-workers watching made Rosa's stomach tighten with nerves. It was one thing to play for students she barely knew, but people who saw her mopping floors every day, somehow that felt even more exposing. "What if I mess up?" Rosa whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her for days. Ms. Beatrice squeezed her hand. "Then you mess up. The world doesn't end. But what if you don't? What if you play beautifully and everyone loves it? That's just as likely, you know." After Ms. Beatrice left, Rosa sat alone in the locker room for several long minutes, gathering her courage. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out her handwritten music sheets. She had recopied them neatly after Professor Thompson's critique, not changing her unique notation system, but making it cleaner, more precise. These pages contained pieces of her soul arranged into melodies. Tonight she would share them with the world. The performers had been asked to gather in a classroom near the auditorium at 6:30 p.m. When Rosa arrived, the room was already filled with students in formal attire, many clutching instruments or sheet music, all looking various degrees of nervous or excited. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, feeling out of place despite her careful outfit. "Rosa!" Nico spotted her first, waving her over to where he stood with Chen and a few other students. "You came." "I said I would," Rosa replied, mustering a smile despite the butterflies in her stomach. "We saved you a seat," Chen said, pulling out a chair. "They're going through the program order now." The showcase coordinator, a brisk woman with a clipboard, was indeed calling out names and assigning numbers. Rosa was number 17 out of 22 performances. That meant she would go on sometime around 8:30 p.m., after most of the student performances but before the faculty showcase that always closed the evening. Number 16 is Liam Chen, playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the coordinator announced. Rosa's heart sank. Liam, the graduate student who had laughed the loudest at her music when Professor Thompson mocked it, would be performing right before her. And with Chopin no less, Professor Thompson's specialty. Liam, standing across the room, caught her eye and smirked. He must have realized who she was by now. The message in his look was clear. "Don't embarrass yourself by following my performance." "Don't mind him," Priya whispered, noticing the exchange. "Liam's technically perfect but plays like a robot. No heart." Slowly the room emptied as performers were called to prepare backstage. Rosa watched them go, one by one, some bouncing with confidence, others looking as terrified as she felt. When Nico's turn came, he gave her a thumbs up before heading out. From the classroom they could faintly hear the applause after each performance. Finally Liam was called, leaving Rosa alone with just a few remaining performers. Her hands had grown cold and she rubbed them together, trying to warm up her fingers. The blue scarf felt like it was choking her now and she loosened it slightly. A few minutes later the coordinator poked her head in. "Rosa Morales, you're up next. Please come backstage now." On shaky legs, Rosa followed her through the dim hallways behind the auditorium. She could hear Liam playing. Technically flawless, as Priya had said, each note precisely where it should be. The audience would certainly be impressed. How could her simple, self-taught music possibly follow such polished perfection? Backstage, Rosa stood in the wings, clutching her music sheets so tightly they were beginning to wrinkle. Through a small gap in the curtains, she could see Professor Thompson in the front row, nodding appreciatively at Liam's performance. Several other faculty members sat near him, along with what appeared to be some important guests. Perhaps the music critic she'd heard might attend. Liam's piece came to a dramatic end, and the audience burst into enthusiastic applause. He took 3 deep bows before strolling off stage, passing Rosa with another smug look. "Good luck following that, cleaning lady," he whispered as he passed. The stage manager gave Rosa a gentle push. "You're on," he said. Rosa's legs felt like lead as she walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding, making it impossible to see beyond the first few rows, though she knew the auditorium was packed with hundreds of people. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, its lid raised, keys gleaming under the spotlights. The audience quieted as she took her seat at the piano. Rosa placed her sheets on the music stand, then realized her hands were shaking too badly to begin. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to find her center. In the silence, someone coughed. Another person shifted in their seat. The weight of all those eyes on her felt crushing. Rosa's mind went blank. What was she doing here? She was a janitor, not a performer. This had been a terrible mistake. Just as she was about to stand up and flee the stage, she felt something warm against her heart. The blue scarf. Music isn't meant to sit quietly on paper. It needs to be set free. Rosa opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keys. She didn't look at her music sheets. She didn't need to. These melodies had lived inside her for years, growing and changing as she had. They were as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She began to play. The opening notes were soft, hesitant, like a question being asked. They told the story of a young girl growing up in a small apartment where music was as necessary as food, where her father would play old folk songs on their battered upright piano after long days of work. The melody was simple but carried the warmth of those memories. As she continued, the music became more complex, the harmonies richer. This was the part that spoke of leaving home, of hard work and loneliness, of cleaning empty rooms while dreaming of something more. There was sadness in these passages, but also determination, a steady rhythm that pushed forward despite obstacles. Rosa lost herself in the music, forgetting the audience, forgetting Professor Thompson, forgetting everything except the story she was telling through her fingers. She didn't play with Liam's technical precision. Sometimes her fingers stumbled slightly. Sometimes the timing wasn't perfect, but there was something in her music that technique alone couldn't create. Raw, honest emotion. In the final section of her piece, the melody transformed again, finding resolution and peace. This was the music of acceptance, of finding beauty in small moments, of creating art even when no one was watching. It built gradually toward a hopeful conclusion, the notes climbing higher, becoming lighter, until they seemed to float above the auditorium like birds taking flight. As the final notes faded away, Rosa suddenly became aware of the complete silence that had fallen over the auditorium. No coughing, no shifting in seats, not even breathing, it seemed. Had they hated it? Had she made a fool of herself after all? She opened her eyes and looked out into the darkness beyond the stage lights. For a moment the silence continued, stretching out unbearably. Then, from somewhere in the back of the auditorium, someone started to clap. Another person joined in, then another. Suddenly, the entire audience erupted into applause. Not the polite, measured applause they had given the other performers, but an enthusiastic, almost wild response that seemed to shake the walls. In the front row, Professor Thompson sat completely still, his face unreadable. But all around him, people were rising to their feet. First Nico and his friends, then other students, then entire rows of audience members. Rosa could see Miss Beatrice and other staff members standing and cheering from their seats near the back. The applause continued as Rosa stood shakily and gave an awkward bow, unused to such attention. As she straightened up, she caught sight of Professor Thompson still seated, while everyone around him stood. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and for a moment, Rosa thought she saw something shift in his expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a reluctant reassessment. As she walked off stage, her legs still wobbly but her heart soaring, Rosa knew that regardless of what the professor thought, she had accomplished something important tonight. She had faced her fear. She had shared her music, and people had listened, really listened, to what she had to say. Backstage, a small crowd of students waited to congratulate her, led by Nico, Chen, and Priya. Their eyes shone with genuine admiration. "That was amazing," Nico said, his voice full of awe. "You made everyone feel something real." Rosa clutched her music sheets to her chest, hardly able to believe what had just happened. For the first time in years, maybe ever, she had been truly seen, not as the invisible woman who cleaned their floors, but as an artist with something valuable to share. Tomorrow, she would go back to her mop and cleaning cart, but she would never again be just the janitor. She had set her music free, and in doing so, had freed something essential in herself as well. The morning after the showcase, Rosa arrived at work earlier than usual. The building was quiet, the hallways still dark as she unlocked the janitor's closet and prepared her cleaning cart. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous night over and over. The lights, the audience, the applause that seemed to go on forever. Part of her wondered if it had all been a dream. Would anyone even remember the janitor who had played her strange, heartfelt music between student performances? Or would life simply go back to normal, with Rosa invisible once again as she mopped floors and emptied trash cans? She was dusting the trophy cases in the main hallway when the first students began to arrive for early morning practice sessions. Usually they walked past without noticing her. Today was different. "That's her," she heard someone whisper, followed by hurried footsteps approaching. "Rosa." It was Nico, his face bright with excitement despite the early hour. "Everyone's talking about your performance. It was the highlight of the showcase." Rosa felt her cheeks grow warm. "I'm sure that's not true," she said, continuing to dust. "There were so many talented performers." "It is true," Nico insisted. "Professor Collins from the composition department wants to talk to you. And the dean was asking about you too." This made Rosa pause in her work. "The dean? Why would the dean care about my playing?" "Because it was brilliant. Different from anything we usually hear at Westfield." Nico glanced at his watch. "I've got to get to practice, but I just wanted you to know. You made a big impression last night. A really big impression." Throughout the morning, Rosa noticed the strange new way people were looking at her. Students smiling and nodding as they passed. Teachers giving her curious glances. A few stopped to compliment her performance directly. Each interaction left her feeling slightly dazed, unused to being the center of attention. By lunchtime, the buzz had grown. Rosa overheard snippets of conversation as she cleaned near the cafeteria. "Did you hear the janitor play?" "Who taught her?" "Better than half the piano majors." She was just finishing the cafeteria floor when Ms. Beatrice approached, beaming with pride. "You're the talk of the school, Rosa, and not just among the students. I heard the faculty talking about you in their lounge." "What are they saying?" Rosa asked, both eager and anxious to know. "Well," Ms. Beatrice lowered her voice conspiratorially, "Professor Collins can't stop raving about your composition style. Says it's refreshingly authentic or something fancy like that. Even old Thompson had something to say, though he wasn't quite as enthusiastic." Rosa's stomach tightened. "What did Professor Thompson say?" Ms. Beatrice hesitated. "Just that your technique was obviously untrained, but he admitted there was—" What was the word he used? "Undeniable emotional resonance in your playing." She grinned. "Coming from him, that's practically a standing ovation." As Rosa continued her afternoon duties, her thoughts kept returning to Professor Thompson. His opinion shouldn't matter. Hadn't she played for herself, not for his approval? Yet she couldn't help wondering what he really thought. Whether her music had changed anything in his rigid views. She was emptying trash bins in the practice room hallway when she heard the unmistakable sound of Professor Thompson's voice coming from nearby practice room A. Instinctively, she slowed her work, listening. "Completely unorthodox notation system," the professor was saying. "But I suppose there is some precedent for self-taught musicians developing their own methods." Rosa moved closer to the partially open door. Through the crack, she could see Professor Thompson standing with an older man she didn't recognize, perhaps one of the music critics who had attended the showcase. The janitor's performance was certainly memorable, the professor continued, adjusting his glasses. Though, of course, with proper training, her natural abilities might be refined into something truly worthwhile. The other man chuckled. "Always the teacher, Harold. But don't you think there's something to be said for raw talent? That woman's playing had more genuine emotion than most of your technically perfect students." Professor Thompson's mouth tightened. "Technical proficiency and emotional expression aren't mutually exclusive, Robert. The best musicians achieve both." "True enough," the other man conceded. "But when was the last time a performance at one of these student showcases moved you?" "Really moved you?" The professor didn't answer immediately. He walked to the piano and idly pressed a few keys. There was something in her playing, he finally admitted so quietly Rosa could barely hear him. "Something I haven't heard in a long time." Just then, a student rushed past, nearly bumping into Rosa's cleaning cart. The noise caught Professor Thompson's attention, and he looked toward the door. Rosa quickly moved away, her heart pounding. Had he seen her? Did he know she'd been listening? She hurried back to her cart and pushed it around the corner, trying to appear busy. A few moments later, the practice room door opened fully, and Professor Thompson emerged with his companion. They walked in the opposite direction, deep in conversation. Rosa released the breath she'd been holding. Something in her playing, something he hadn't heard in a long time. Coming from Professor Thompson, that was, well, she wasn't quite sure what it was, but it made her stand a little straighter as she continued her work. Later that afternoon, as Rosa was cleaning the windows in the administrative hallway, she heard someone call her name. She turned to see Dean Patterson, the head of the entire conservatory, standing in the doorway of her office. "Ms. Morales," the dean said warmly, "I was hoping to catch you. Do you have a moment?" Rosa nodded nervously, setting aside her cleaning supplies and following the dean into her office. The room was elegant yet comfortable, with awards and photographs covering the walls. The dean shaking hands with famous musicians, conducting orchestras, receiving honors. "Please, sit down." Dean Patterson gestured to a chair across from her desk. "I wanted to personally tell you how much I enjoyed your performance last night. It was truly remarkable." "Thank you," Rosa said, perching on the edge of the chair, still wearing her gray janitor's uniform, feeling completely out of place. "I understand you're entirely self-taught?" the dean asked. "Yes. My father taught me the basics when I was young. The rest I figured out on my own." The dean nodded thoughtfully. "And your notation system, that's your own creation as well?" "It is," Rosa admitted. "I never learned to read music properly, so I made up my own way of writing it down." Rather than looking disapproving, the dean seemed intrigued. "That's fascinating. You know, throughout music history, many composers and performers developed their own systems when traditional methods didn't serve their needs." She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, placing it on the desk between them. "The reason I wanted to speak with you, Ms. Morales, is that Westfield has a special scholarship program for non-traditional students with exceptional talent. It's not widely advertised, but it exists specifically for cases like yours." Rosa stared at the folder, not quite understanding. "Scholarship?" "Yes," the dean continued. "It would cover classes in music theory, composition, and performance. You would still work here, but with reduced hours, allowing you time to study. We've had staff members benefit from this program before, though I must say none with quite your level of raw talent." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Rosa processed the dean's words. "Study music? Here at Westfield?" The idea was so far from anything she had imagined possible that she could barely wrap her mind around it. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "You don't need to decide right now," the dean assured her. "Take the information, think about it. Talk to Professor Collins in the composition department. She's particularly interested in working with you." She slid the folder across the desk toward Rosa. "Just promise me you'll consider it. Talent like yours shouldn't be limited to after-hours playing when no one's listening." As Rosa left the office, clutching the folder to her chest, her mind was spinning. A scholarship, classes, a chance to learn the things she'd always wondered about, to develop her music with guidance rather than guesswork. It seemed impossible, yet the folder in her hands was real enough. She was so distracted that she nearly bumped into someone turning the corner, Professor Thompson. They both stopped abruptly face to face in the narrow hallway. "Ms. Morales," he said stiffly, recognizing her from the showcase. "Professor Thompson," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Rosa waited for him to say something dismissive, to remind her of her place, but he seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Your performance last night was unexpected." Rosa wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or criticism. "Thank you, I think. Your technique needs considerable work," he continued, his tone professorial. "Your fingering was often incorrect, your timing inconsistent, and your dynamics could use refinement." "Of course." Rosa felt a familiar sinking feeling. What had she expected? But then Professor Thompson surprised her. "However," he added, his voice softening slightly, "there was an authenticity to your playing that is uncommon, even rare." He glanced at the folder in her hands, recognizing it. "I see the dean has spoken to you about the scholarship program." Rosa nodded, still speechless. "Should you decide to accept," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I would be not unwilling to include you in my advanced composition seminar next semester, after you've completed the basic theory courses, of course." It was the closest thing to an olive branch she could imagine coming from Professor Thompson. Not quite an apology for his mockery, not quite enthusiasm, but an acknowledgement that perhaps he had judged too quickly, too harshly. "I'll think about it," Rosa said, finding her voice at last. "Thank you." As Professor Thompson continued down the hallway, Rosa stood still for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. In the space of 24 hours, her world had completely changed. From invisible janitor to recognized musician, from cleaning practice rooms to potentially studying in them, all because she had found the courage to share her music, to let others hear the melodies that had lived so long in her heart alone. As she resumed her duties, the weight of the folder tucked safely in her pocket reminded her that sometimes the most unexpected doors could open. If only you were brave enough to play your song. 3 months had passed since the winter showcase, and spring was beginning to touch the grounds of Westfield Conservatory. The ancient maple trees lining the walkways showed tiny buds of green, and students often practiced with windows open to catch the fresh air. Rosa's life had transformed in ways she still found hard to believe. After much soul-searching and encouragement from her new supporters, she had accepted the dean's scholarship offer. Now she worked as a janitor only 3 days a week, spending the rest of her time in classes, studying music theory, composition, and piano technique. The transition hadn't been easy. Most days Rosa felt like she was learning a new language, one where familiar sounds were represented by strange symbols she struggled to understand. The other students in her beginner classes were mostly 18 and 19 years old, making Rosa, at 36, feel ancient by comparison. But what she lacked in youth she made up for in determination and passion. Today was special, the final day of the spring term, and the day of the Student Composer Showcase, where Rosa would present her first fully notated composition in traditional musical notation. She had spent countless hours working on it, erasing and rewriting, struggling to translate the music she heard in her head into the formal language of classical composition. "You're overthinking it again," said Professor Collins during their final session together the day before. The older woman had taken Rosa under her wing from the start, patient with her struggles but firm in her expectations. "Remember, the notation is just a tool to communicate your musical ideas to others. The ideas themselves, those come from you, not from the symbols on the page." Now, as Rosa mopped the conservatory's main entrance one last time before changing for the showcase, she repeated those words to herself. The music comes from you, not the symbols. It had become her mantra over these challenging months. "There you are," Nico's voice echoed across the marble floor. He hurried toward her, waving a program, hot off the press. "Look, your name right there between mine and Priya's." Rosa leaned her mop against the wall and took the program with damp hands. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. Rosa Morales from Pathways, original composition for piano. Seeing her name printed so formally gave her a strange feeling, pride mixed with terror. Her piece would be performed by Priya, since the showcase required composition students to have performance students play their works. Rosa had been hesitant at first, wanting to play her own creation, but she'd come to appreciate hearing her music through someone else's interpretation. "Nervous?" Nico asked, studying her face. "Terrified," Rosa admitted. "What if Professor Thompson hates it? He's been almost civil to me these past months, but I know he still thinks I don't really belong here." Nico shook his head firmly. "Stop worrying about him. This isn't about Thompson. It's about your music. Besides, rumor has it the dean invited some people from the city symphony to attend, and they're much more important than one grumpy professor." The city symphony? Rosa hadn't heard that. The butterflies in her stomach multiplied. She glanced at her watch. Only 2 hours until the showcase began. "I need to finish this floor, then get ready. Need help?" Nico offered, already rolling up his sleeves. Rosa smiled gratefully. That was another change these past months. Real friendships with students and faculty who saw her as a fellow musician, not just the woman who cleaned their classrooms. An hour later, Rosa sat in practice room C, the very room where her journey had begun, reviewing her composition one last time before the showcase. The neat, precise notation still looked foreign to her eyes, though she'd written every note herself. The door opened, and Priya peeked in.
"There you are."
"I've been looking everywhere." She entered, elegant in her performance attire. A simple black dress with a colorful scarf that reminded Rosa of her own lucky blue one, now carefully folded in her bag. "Just making sure everything's perfect," Rosa said. Gesturing to the sheet music, Priya sat beside her on the piano bench. "It's already perfect. I've been practicing it for weeks, remember? I've never played anything that feels so real." She placed her fingers on the keys, playing a brief passage from the middle of Rosa's composition, a flowing, wistful sequence that represented the years Rosa had spent watching others perform while she cleaned in silence. "You play it beautifully," Rosa said, meaning it. Hearing her music through Priya's skilled hands was like seeing her own thoughts reflected in a clear mirror. Recognizable but somehow enhanced. Refined. "It's easy to play music that speaks the truth," Priya replied. "But I wanted to ask, there's this section near the end." She played another passage, a triumphant, rising melody. "I've been playing it precisely as written, but I keep feeling like it wants to breathe more. To linger here and here," she demonstrated, adding slight pauses that weren't in the notation. In the past, Rosa might have deferred to Priya's greater training, apologizing for her amateur notation. Now she considered the suggestion thoughtfully, hearing both versions in her mind. "Try it once more your way," she requested. Priya played the passage again with those subtle hesitations that made the triumphant moment feel even more earned, more human. Rosa nodded slowly. "Yes, that's better. That's how I hear it in my head, but I didn't know how to write it." "That's the limitation of notation," came a voice from the doorway. "No matter how precise, it can never capture every nuance of musical intention." Both women turned to see Professor Thompson standing there, his tall figure silhouetted against the hallway light. How long had he been listening? "Professor?" Priya acknowledged, slightly startled. "We were just making some final adjustments to Rosa's piece, so I heard." He entered the room, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "Ms. Morales, might I see your composition?" Rosa hesitated, then handed him the neatly printed pages. This was the man who had publicly mocked her music just months ago. Though their interactions had been civil since she began her studies, there remained an unspoken tension between them. Professor Thompson studied the notation silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "Your formal notation has improved considerably. Professor Collins has taught you well." "Thank you," Rosa said cautiously. "However," he continued, and Rosa braced herself for criticism, "there's a certain vitality in your original notational style that isn't fully captured here." Rosa and Priya exchanged surprised glances. Was Professor Thompson actually expressing preference for Rosa's homemade notation system? "What do you mean?" Rosa asked. The professor gestured to a passage. "Here, for instance. In traditional notation, we have limited ways to indicate the emotional intent behind the notes. Dynamics, tempo markings, articulation, they're all rather clinical. Your original system, with its unconventional symbols and expressive annotations, sometimes conveyed the feeling more directly." He looked at her with what almost appeared to be respect. It was unorthodox but effective in its own way. Coming from Professor Thompson, this was astonishing praise. Rosa didn't quite know how to respond. "I've been trying to learn the proper way." "The proper way is whatever communicates your musical intention most effectively," he interrupted. "That's something I've been reconsidering lately." Their conversation was cut short by an announcement over the building's speaker system. "Attention all performers. The Spring Composer Showcase will begin in 30 minutes. Please report to the green room now." Professor Thompson handed the music back to Rosa. "I look forward to hearing the full piece performed, Ms. Morales." He turned to leave, then paused. "And I owe you an apology." Rosa stared at him, not sure she'd heard correctly. "An apology?" "For my behavior regarding your music earlier this year. It was dismissive and unkind. More importantly, it was incorrect." His admission seemed physically painful to him, but he continued. "Music education has value, considerable value, but it is not the only path to meaningful artistic expression. Your performance at the Winter Showcase reminded me of that." Before Rosa could respond, he gave a curt nod and left the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. "Did that really just happen?" Priya asked, wide-eyed. Rosa shook her head in wonder. "I'm not sure. But we should get to the green room." The showcase was held in the smaller recital hall rather than the main auditorium, creating a more intimate atmosphere for the student compositions. Rosa sat in the audience, watching as one student after another had their pieces performed by fellow students. Some works were experimental and abstract, others more traditional, but all represented sincere artistic expression. When it was time for Pathways to be performed, the program director announced, "Our next piece is by Rosa Morales, a new voice in our composition department with a unique journey to Westfield. Her work will be performed by Priya Patel." Rosa held her breath as Priya walked gracefully to the piano. From her seat, Rosa could see Professor Thompson sitting near the front, next to Dean Patterson and several well-dressed visitors, perhaps the symphony representatives Nico had mentioned. Priya began to play, and Rosa's world narrowed to the sound of her music filling the room. The opening notes were gentle, questioning like her first tentative explorations of the practice room pianos after hours. The melody developed slowly, gaining confidence and complexity, just as Rosa had over these months of study. In the middle section, when Priya reached the wistful passage they had discussed, Rosa could feel the audience leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the emotional pull of the music. And at the triumphant conclusion, with those perfectly placed hesitations that made the resolution feel all the more satisfying, she saw Professor Thompson nodding almost imperceptibly. When the final notes faded, there was that magical moment of silence that Rosa had come to recognize as the highest compliment an audience could give. That breathless pause before applause, when the music still hung in the air, too beautiful to disturb. Then came the applause, warm and genuine. Priya stood and bowed, then gestured toward Rosa in the audience. Reluctantly, Rosa stood to acknowledge the applause, still uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but proud of what she had created. After the showcase, as people mingled and chatted in the reception area, Professor Collins found Rosa standing somewhat awkwardly by the refreshment table. "There she is, our rising star," the professor said warmly. "That was beautiful work, Rosa. And I hear Thompson actually complimented you." "That's rarer than a solar eclipse," Rosa smiled. "He did. It was unexpected. Well, get ready for more surprises. Those visitors from the City Symphony? They're starting a community composition initiative, looking for diverse voices in classical music. The dean recommended you, and after hearing your piece tonight, they're very interested." As Professor Collins explained the opportunity, a 6-month mentorship program, with the possibility of having a full orchestral work performed by the symphony, Rosa felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. 1 year ago, she had been invisibly cleaning these halls, playing in secret, her music unheard. Now she stood at the beginning of a path she had never dreamed possible, with her compositions being performed, appreciated, and even sought after. As she looked around the reception room, at the students and teachers who now knew her by name, at Professor Thompson engaged in serious discussion with the symphony directors, at Nico and Chen and Priya celebrating with her, Rosa understood the most important lesson of all. Music, like people, should never be judged by appearances or credentials alone. The most beautiful melodies could come from anywhere, even from the heart of a janitor who simply needed the courage to play.